There is a specific kind of relationship that defies every category available to describe it. Not friendship, not alliance, not professional partnership in any conventional sense. Something stranger and more durable than any of those things. The relationship that develops between two people who have spent years trying to destroy each other, who succeed and fail at this in ways that change both of them permanently, and who emerge from the wreckage of that sustained opposition with a form of mutual understanding so deep and so specific that it cannot be replicated through any other means. The relationship between Frank Lucas and Richie Roberts is exactly this kind of relationship. It does not make sense until you understand both men completely. And once you understand both men completely, it makes a different kind of sense than almost any other relationship in this entire story. Richie Roberts was a D agent, not a corrupt one, and this distinction matters enormously in a story where corrupt law enforcement officials are not exceptional but endemic, where the institutional corruption that Frank Lucas funded and maintained extended across dozens of officers and agents at every level of the enforcement hierarchy. Richie Roberts was, by every account from his colleagues, and from the federal prosecutors who worked with him, and from Frank Lucas himself, genuinely honest in a world where honesty was genuinely unusual. He was honest to the point where it created problems for him, where his refusal to participate in the specific forms of institutional corruption that surrounded him in his professional environment made him more isolated from his colleagues than connected to them, where the specific quality of his integrity was a form of professional liability rather than an asset in the specific culture of law enforcement in New York in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He was, in the precise formulation that the accounts of the period consistently use, too honest for his own good. And he spent years with the specific patience and methodical discipline of a man who believes completely in what he is doing, building the case that eventually put Frank Lucas in federal prison. The story of how those two men, the most significant narcotics trafficker in New York City history and the D agent, whose years of honest investigation eventually brought him down, ended up in a relationship where Frank Lucas trusted Richie Roberts with his most important legal interests is the story this video exists to tell. To understand Richie Roberts, you have to understand the specific institutional environment he was operating in during the years he spent building the case against Frank Lucas. The New York law enforcement world of the late 1960s and early 1970s was not simply an environment where corruption existed as a deviant exception to institutional norms. It was an environment where corruption had become, in significant parts of the narcotics enforcement apparatus, the norm itself, where the question was not whether an officer or agent had corrupt arrangements, but what form those arrangements took and how much they were worth. Frank Lucas's cooperation with federal prosecutors after his 1975 arrest produced more than 100 convictions of police officers and federal agents, which tells you something important about the scale of what he was documenting. He was not describing a few bad actors embedded in otherwise clean institutions. He was describing a systemic condition in which the corrupt relationships he had built and maintained were not aberrations, but expressions of something deeply structural about how narcotics enforcement worked in New York at that time. Into this environment, Richie Roberts brought a form of professional integrity that was, paradoxically, almost as disruptive as Frank Lucas's criminal enterprise. An honest cop in a corrupt institution is not simply a clean version of what everyone else is doing. He is a threat to the colleagues whose arrangements he refuses to share, to the supervisors whose complicity he implicitly calls into question by refusing to participate, to the entire informal institutional culture that has organized itself around the assumption that everyone eventually comes to the same accommodation. with the money and the power that flows through narcotics enforcement. Richie Roberts never came to that accommodation. His colleagues, by multiple accounts from the period, resented him for it. His marriage failed under the pressure of a professional life defined by a kind of moral stubbornness that made ordinary domesticity almost impossible to maintain. He was not, by any account, an easy man to know, but he was a genuinely exceptional investigator, patient, methodical, analytically rigorous in the way that building a case against an operation as sophisticated as Frank Lucas's required. He understood that the direct approach, trying to catch Frank in the act of narcotics distribution, was unlikely to succeed against an organization whose internal discipline and compartmentalization made it exceptionally resistant to the kinds of infiltration and surveillance that had worked against less sophisticated operations. So he built his case differently. He built it through financial analysis, through the patient work of tracing the economic consequences of Frank's operation, even when the operational mechanics of the operation itself remained largely invisible to convention, a surveillance, the Teaneck house, the real estate portfolio, the legitimate business fronts, the specific financial footprint of an operation generating millions of dollars a week in a city where the movement of that much money always leaves traces, however carefully the organization tries to obscure them. Richie Roberts followed the traces for years with the specific methodical patience of a man who understood that the case he was building was not something that could be rushed without destroying it, and who was willing to invest the time that the work required, regardless of the institutional pressure to show faster results. The case that eventually produced the arrest warrant for Frank Lucas in August 1975 was, in significant part, Richie Roberts's work, years of patient, financial investigation that had traced the economic reality of Frank's empire, even when its operational details remained hidden. When Frank Lucas opened his door in Teaneck on the morning of August 16, 1975, and found federal agents on his porch, Richie Roberts was part of the structure that put them there. The specific dynamic of the Frank Lucas prosecution in the months after the arrest is where the relationship between the two men begins to take the unexpected shape that makes this story worth telling. Frank Lucas, having made the decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors to provide the comprehensive inside account of law enforcement corruption that resulted in more than 100 convictions, was, in the process of that cooperation, spending considerable time in direct contact with federal law enforcement officials. The institutional absurdity of this situation was not lost on anyone involved. The most significant narcotics trafficker in New York City history, sitting in federal custody, providing the information that was dismantling the corrupt law enforcement network that had protected him, in cooperation with the honest federal agents who had spent years trying to bring him down. Richie Roberts, as one of the investigators most centrally involved in the case, was among the people Frank Lucas encountered in this specific and peculiar context. What happened in those encounters is documented in various accounts from both men in subsequent years. And what the accounts consistently describe is something that surprised both of them, a form of mutual recognition that cut through the institutional roles, pursued and pursuer, criminal and investigator, that had defined their relationship for years and revealed something underneath those roles that neither man had expected to find. Frank Lucas recognized in Richie Roberts someone whose relationship to integrity was genuinely comparable to his own, not in its content, obviously, since the integrity Frank valued was the integrity of a man who protected his own organization and his own people within the specific moral universe of the criminal enterprise he led, while Roberts's integrity was the integrity of a man who refused to compromise his professional standards regardless of the institutional pressure to do so. But in its form, both men and the specific worlds they inhabited, had maintained a consistent and costly commitment to a set of values that most of the people around them had found either inconvenient or incomprehensible. Frank had built an empire on a form of organizational discipline that was, within its own context, genuinely principled, the refusal to cut Blue Magic's purity when cutting it would have been more profitable, the insistence on family loyalty as the foundation of the distribution network when hired loyalty would have been more convenient, the specific ethical code of a man who operated within a criminal enterprise with a consistency of standards that most of his competitors lacked. Roberts had maintained his professional integrity in an institutional environment that had actively discouraged it, at considerable personal cost. They were, in a specific and paradoxical way, more similar to each other than either was to most of the other people in their respective worlds. This recognition did not make them friends in any ordinary sense. The relationship was too asymmetrical, too defined by years of opposed institutional roles, too complicated by the specific facts of what each man had done to the other through those roles. But it produced something real, a form of respect that was, in both directions, genuinely meant, and that laid the foundation for what came later. Frank Lucas, in the years following his cooperation and his eventual release from federal prison in 1981, faced a specific legal challenge that most men in his position faced: appealing the conditions of his conviction, navigating the post-release legal landscape, managing the ongoing legal consequences of a case whose complexity did not end with his sentencing. He needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, someone who understood the case from the inside, who had lived through the investigation and the prosecution, who knew the specific details of what had been done and how and why, in a way that most defense attorneys never could from reading the case file after the fact. There were not many people who fit that description. There was, in fact, one person who fit it better than anyone else available. Richie Roberts, by this point in his career, had left federal law enforcement and become an attorney. The specific arc of Roberts's post-DEA career, from federal agent to lawyer, was its own kind of story, reflecting the same kind of reconsideration of institutional roles that characterized so much of what happened in the aftermath of the Frank Lucas case. The institutional environment of New York law. Enforcement in the 1970s had been so deeply damaged by the corruption. Revelations that Frank's cooperation had helped produce that many of the people who had been part of that environment on both sides of it found themselves reconsidering what their roles had actually meant and what kind of work they wanted to do in the years that remained. Roberts, who had spent years in an institution whose corruption he had refused to participate in, found the transition to private legal practice a form of release from the specific institutional contradictions that had defined his law enforcement career. And Frank Lucas, sitting down to think about who he trusted to handle his legal interests in the complex post-prison landscape, arrived at a conclusion that surprised nearly everyone who heard it. He wanted Richie Roberts. The logic of this choice, once you understand both men and the history between them, is less surprising than it initially appears. Frank Lucas had spent his entire career making decisions based on a specific and consistent assessment of trustworthiness, an assessment that prioritized demonstrated integrity over institutional loyalty, that valued a track record of consistent behavior over professions of friendship or alliance. He had trusted his brothers because their loyalty had been demonstrated across decades of shared experience. He had distrusted corrupt law enforcement officials even while paying them, understanding that men who could be bought could also be bought by someone else. He had extended trust carefully and deliberately, always with his eyes open about the specific basis of that trust and its specific limits. Richie Roberts had demonstrated, across years of documented behavior, a form of integrity that Frank Lucas understood and respected, even though it had worked directly against him. Roberts had built the case that put Frank in prison through honest investigation, without the corruption and the shortcutting that characterized so much of the law enforcement environment around him. He had done it cleanly, which meant that the case, when it was built, was solid in a way that cases built through corrupt means were not. There was a specific kind of professional respect that Frank Lucas, who built everything in his own world through discipline and consistency and quality, felt for Richie Roberts's approach to his own work, even the work that had been directed specifically at destroying Frank's empire. And there was a specific form of trust that followed from that respect. If Roberts had been honest enough to build the case against Frank Lucas through legitimate investigation rather than through the corruption that would have been easier and more convenient, he was probably honest enough to represent Frank Lucas with the same professional integrity. The decision to ask Roberts to handle his legal appeals was, characteristically for Frank Lucas, a calculated one. It was also, in its way, one of the most remarkable decisions in this entire story. The pursued asking the pursuer to become his advocate. The man whose investigation had taken everything, asking the man who had lost everything to trust him with what remained. Richie Roberts accepted. His own account of why he accepted, given in various interviews over the years, emphasizes the same mutual recognition that had developed during the cooperation period, the same sense of two men who had operated on opposite sides of a sustained conflict, discovering that they understood each other in ways that transcended the conflict itself. He also, by his own account, believed that Frank Lucas had fulfilled his end of the cooperation agreement with a completeness and an honesty that deserved recognition, that the man who had provided the comprehensive inside account of law enforcement corruption that Roberts and his colleagues had spent years trying to document from the outside had done something genuinely significant, something that warranted a form of reciprocal commitment that went beyond the institutional relationships of the formal legal process. The legal work Roberts did for Frank Lucas in the years following his release in 1981 produced results: reduced supervision conditions, modified parole requirements, the gradual normalization of Frank's post-prison legal status that reflected competent and committed representation by someone who understood the case better than almost anyone else available. The relationship that developed through this work was not friendship in any ordinary sense of the word. It was something more specific and more unusual, a partnership built on mutual respect between two men who had earned that respect from each other through years of sustained opposition, and who had found, on the other side of that opposition, a form of trust that neither had expected to find. There, the specific details of the legal representation and its outcomes are less important to this story than what the relationship itself reveals about both men and about the larger world they inhabited. Frank Lucas's decision to trust Richie Roberts with his most important legal interests was, in one reading, simply a pragmatic calculation. The best lawyer available for this specific situation was the man who knew the case better than anyone else. But it was also something more than that. It was an acknowledgement from Frank Lucas that the specific form of integrity that Richie Roberts had demonstrated across years of professional opposition was a form of trustworthiness, worth recognizing even when, especially when, that integrity had been directed against you. Most people reserve their trust for people who have been on their side. Frank Lucas trusted someone who had spent years trying to destroy him because the way that person had tried to destroy him demonstrated qualities that Frank, with his specific and deeply considered understanding of what trustworthiness actually meant, valued more than simple alliance. This is, in a way, the most Frank Lucas moment in the entire Frank Lucas story. Not the shooting on 116th Street, not Blue Magic, not the cooperation agreement. The decision to look across the specific wreckage of a sustained conflict and recognize in your opponent someone whose integrity you trust, more than the integrity of most. Of the people who have called themselves your friends, Richie Roberts, for his part, demonstrated through his willingness to represent Frank Lucas that his own integrity was not simply the integrity of a man who followed institutional rules when they were inconvenient. It was the integrity of a man who could extend genuine, professional commitment to someone he had worked for years to put in prison, because the work itself, done with honesty and with the specific, professional quality that Roberts brought to everything he did, demanded that commitment, regardless of the personal and institutional history involved. The story of Frank Lucas and Richie Roberts is, in its own complicated and entirely unexpected way, a story about what integrity actually means when it is tested against the most uncomfortable circumstances available. It means recognizing quality wherever it exists, even in your opponent. It means extending trust where trust has been earned, even across years of sustained conflict. It means understanding that the most reliable guide to what someone will do for you is what they have already done, and that the most significant thing Richie Roberts had already done in his years of honest investigation and his refusal to participate in the institutional corruption that surrounded him was demonstrate a form of professional integrity that Frank Lucas, who had built and maintained his own empire on the foundation of understanding exactly what trustworthiness meant and exactly how rare it was, recognized as genuine. The movie that Ridley Scott made in 2007, which brought the Frank Lucas story to its widest audience, depicted both men and the relationship between them with the specific simplifications that a film narrative requires. Frank as the brilliant and ruthless architect of an empire, Roberts as the honest cop whose dogged investigation eventually brings him down. Both depictions are accurate as far as they go, what the film could not fully capture, in the time available for two characters whose relationship spans decades, and whose significance to each other developed across layers of opposition and recognition that resist. Compression into cinematic shorthand was the specific quality of what developed between them on the other side of the conflict. The mutual respect, the unexpected trust, the relationship that defied every available category, and that, once it existed, turned out to be one of the most durable things either man built in a life defined by building things that were meant to last. Frank Lucas built blue magic and an empire. Richie Roberts built a case and a career. They spent years trying to destroy each other. And what they built together, on the other side of all of that, was something that neither had planned, and that turned out, in its own way, to be as significant as anything they had built apart. That is the story nobody tells when they tell the Frank Lucas story. The cop who caught the king, and the king who, when he needed someone he could trust completely, looked across 30 years of history and chose the cop. Subscribe now if this story showed you something about loyalty and trust and the specific way that genuine integrity, wherever it exists, on whatever side of whatever conflict, eventually finds its way to being recognized. Drop a comment. Does the relationship between Frank Lucas and Richie Roberts make sense to you, or does it still feel impossible? Because the answer to that question tells you something important about how you understand what trust actually means. Next week, Frank Lucas watched the KKK kill his cousin at age 6. What he did next set everything in motion. The origin story. Turn on notifications. The real story always starts earlier than you expect, and it always makes more sense when you know where it began. To fully appreciate the paradox at the center of this story. It helps to understand what Richie Roberts' career looked like from the inside, not the triumphant narrative of the honest cop who brought down the most significant narcotics operation in New York City history, but the day-to-day professional reality of a man whose integrity made him. For most of his law enforcement career, something close to an outcast within his own institution. Roberts joined the New Jersey State Police and later moved into federal narcotics enforcement at a time when the institutional culture of narcotics enforcement in the New York area was, as the subsequent corruption investigations would document in exhaustive detail, deeply compromised. He was not naive about this. He understood, relatively early in his career, that the environment he was operating in was one where the expected accommodation, the gradual adjustment of professional standards to the practical realities of working in daily proximity to enormous sums of money and the corrupt relationships that proximity produced was being made by most of the people around him. He refused to make it. This refusal was not, by his own account, experienced as heroic. It was experienced as isolating, as a form of professional life that required maintaining a constant distance from colleagues whose company might otherwise have been valuable, from institutional relationships that might otherwise have provided the kind of support and camaraderie that makes a difficult professional life sustainable. His marriage, as noted in virtually every account of his life and career, did not survive the specific pressures of his professional isolation and his single-minded focus on investigations that consume the kind of time and energy that leaves little room for anything else. He paid real costs for his integrity. The costs were not abstract or theoretical. They were specific and personal and ongoing throughout the years of his law enforcement career. What kept him going, by every account, was the work itself, the specific satisfaction of building a case correctly, of following evidence wherever it led, without the distortions that corruption introduced, of knowing that the work he was doing was real and would hold up because it had been done honestly. The Frank Lucas investigation gave Roberts the opportunity to do this kind of work at the highest level available to him, to apply everything he had developed across years of careful investigation to the most significant target in his professional environment, to build a case that would, if it held, represent the most consequential narcotics prosecution in New York City history. He approached it with the same patient, methodical discipline that characterized everything he did. He was not, by any measure, a flashy investigator. He did not rely on informants in the way that many narcotics investigators did, a method that was effective in the short term, but that produced the kind of testimony dependent on the reliability of people whose reliability was, almost by definition, suspect. He built his case through documents and financial analysis and the patient tracing of economic patterns that told a story, even when the people creating those patterns refused to talk. It took years. The institutional pressure to produce faster results, to show the kind of arrests and seizures that justified the resources being invested in the investigation, was constant. Roberts resisted it. He understood that a case built prematurely on insufficient evidence would either fail to produce a conviction or would produce a conviction that would not survive appeal. And he was not willing to accept either outcome for the sake of appearing productive to supervisors who wanted to see numbers. This patience, this willingness to build slowly and correctly rather than quickly and carelessly, is what produced the case that eventually put Frank Lucas in prison. And it is, paradoxically, what Frank Lucas recognized and respected in Richie Roberts when their paths crossed on the other side of the prosecution. Frank Lucas had spent his entire career building things correctly rather than quickly. The Thailand supply chain built over months of relationship development rather than rushed into existence. Blue Magic introduced to the market carefully and managed with quality control rather than flooded into distribution and diluted for short-term profit. The Vietnam coffin operation developed over time with attention to logistics rather than implemented carelessly and exposed through sloppiness. He recognized in Richie Roberts a man who operated according to the same principle. that things worth building are worth building correctly, and that the patience to build them correctly is a form of discipline that most people lack and that produces results that most people cannot achieve. This recognition did not make what Roberts had done to Frank's empire any less significant. The case Roberts built had destroyed 7 years of work, an empire generating millions of dollars a day, and had put Frank Lucas in federal prison for what would ultimately be 5 years of his life. These were real consequences, and Frank Lucas was not the kind of man who minimized the significance of real consequences. But Frank Lucas was also not the kind of man who let the specific roles that people had occupied in the past determine how he assessed their value in the present. He had always evaluated people on the specific qualities they demonstrated through their actual behavior, rather than through their institutional affiliations or their stated loyalties. Richie Roberts had demonstrated, through his actual behavior across years of investigation, qualities that Frank Lucas valued. When Frank needed someone to represent his legal interests in the complex post-prison landscape, that demonstration mattered more than the specific role Roberts had played in the history between them. The broader significance of the Frank Lucas and Richie Roberts relationship extends beyond the specific facts of their individual histories. It is, in a way, a story about what happens when two people, who have been forced by circumstance into sustained opposition, discover that the opposition itself has produced a form of understanding that neither could have achieved through any other means. There is a specific kind of knowledge that comes from being someone's most serious adversary, from studying them closely enough and long enough to build a case against them, or to build an empire resistant to their efforts to dismantle it. Roberts knew Frank Lucas in the specific way that a skilled investigator knows the person he has spent years investigating, not as a friend or a confidant, but as a subject of sustained analytical attention, which produces its own kind of intimacy. Frank Lucas knew Richie Roberts in the specific way that a man who has had his organization studied and eventually penetrated by a persistent opponent knows that opponent with a kind of reluctant professional respect that is, in its own way, more honest than many forms of admiration. These forms of knowledge, the investigator's knowledge of the investigated, the criminal's knowledge of the honest cop who finally got him, are not the usual foundation for trust and eventual collaboration. But they are, paradoxically, among the most reliable foundations available, precisely because they are based on sustained observation of actual behavior, rather than on the projections and assumptions that other relationships typically rely on. Roberts knew, from years of investigation, that Frank Lucas was not simply violent and dangerous, that he was also disciplined, organizationally sophisticated, and capable of the kind of sustained commitment to a set of standards that most people in his world lacked. Frank knew, from years of being the subject of Roberts's investigation, and from their interaction during the cooperation period, that Roberts was not simply an institutional enemy, that he was a man whose professional integrity was genuine and consistent, and whose word, once given, would be kept. These mutual recognitions produced, on the other side of everything that had happened between them, something that neither man had planned or sought. A relationship built on the specific and unusual foundation of having been each other's most serious adversary, and having emerged from that sustained opposition with a deeper understanding of each other than most. Relationships produce even through decades of friendship, end-to-end. Collaboration. The Frank Lucas and Richie Roberts story was depicted in the 2007 Ridley Scott film, American Gangster, with Russell Crowe playing Roberts and Denzel Washington playing Frank Lucas. The film captures something real about both men and something real about their respective relationships, to integrity in worlds that discouraged it. What it necessarily compresses is the full arc of what developed between them after the events. The film depicts the cooperation, the legal representation, the decades of post-prison relationship that defied every expectation and every category. The film ends, roughly, where this story's most interesting chapter begins. Because the interesting question about Frank Lucas and Richie Roberts is not what happened when they were adversaries. It is what happened when they stopped being adversaries and discovered what remained. What remained, it turns out, was the most durable thing either of them built. Not blue magic, not the case that brought it down. The specific mutual respect and eventual collaboration of two men who recognized in each other a quality, a consistency of standards, maintained against institutional pressure, a willingness to build things correctly rather than quickly, that they had found almost nowhere else in their respective worlds. That is the real story. And it begins where every good story about people who have been adversaries begins, with the moment when the conflict ends and both parties have to decide who they are to each other now. Frank Lucas decided that Richie Roberts was someone he could trust. Richie Roberts decided that Frank Lucas was someone worth representing. Both decisions were, characteristically for both men, correct. And the relationship that resulted, unexpected, unprecedented, impossible to categorize and impossible to dismiss, stands as the most unusual and perhaps the most instructive chapter in a story that has never been short on unusual chapters. The cop who caught the king who chose the cop, and the specific form of trust that sustained opposition, honestly conducted on both sides, can produce when everything else has finally been stripped away. There is one more dimension of the Roberts story that demands examination, because it illuminates something about Frank Lucas's decision-making that goes deeper than the pragmatic calculation of choosing the best available lawyer. Frank Lucas, in the years of his empire, had cultivated dozens of relationships with people in positions of institutional power, police officers, federal agents, politicians, judges, real estate agents, businessmen. Every one of these relationships was, from Frank's perspective, a calculated extension of trust based on a specific assessment of what the person could provide and what they would require in return. The corrupt law enforcement officials he maintained were not trusted in any deep sense. They were managed, which is a different thing. Frank understood that a man who takes money to betray his institutional oath will take money to betray anything, and he structured his relationships with corrupt officials accordingly. Payments regular enough to maintain the relationship. Compartmentalization careful enough to limit the damage if any individual relationship failed. He never confused a managed relationship with the trusted one. The genuinely trusted relationships in Frank Lucas's life were few and specific. His brothers, whose loyalty he understood as unconditional. Bumpy Johnson, whose teaching he had absorbed so completely that Bumpy's voice continued to inform his decisions long after Bumpy's death. And, in the specific and unexpected way that this story documents, Richie Roberts. The inclusion of Roberts in this small category of genuine trust is not incidental. It reflects a specific assessment on Frank Lucas's part, an assessment formed through years of observation of Roberts's behavior, in the investigation and in the cooperation period, and in their subsequent direct interactions, that Roberts's integrity was the real thing rather than a performance. Real integrity, in Frank Lucas's understanding of the world, was extraordinarily rare. He had spent his career operating in environments where it was almost entirely absent, where the question was never whether people could be compromised, but only how. The few people who could not be compromised occupied a specific and significant place in Frank's understanding of the world, not because their integrity was convenient for him, but because its rarity made it genuinely remarkable. Richie Roberts could not be compromised. Frank Lucas had operated for years in an environment where this was verifiably true, where Roberts had demonstrated, through sustained and costly resistance to the institutional corruption that surrounded him, that his professional standards were not negotiable. This demonstration, which had been directed specifically against Frank's operation during the years of the investigation, was nevertheless the basis for the trust that developed afterward. Frank Lucas trusted Richie Roberts because Roberts had proven, in the most rigorous possible way available, by refusing to take a shortcut that would have benefited him personally while investigating the person who would eventually ask him for help, that his word was worth something. That kind of proof, for a man who had spent his entire career distinguishing between people whose word was worth something and people whose word was worth nothing, was not something Frank Lucas forgot or discounted. The specific irony that the most significant demonstration of Richie Roberts's trustworthiness available to Frank Lucas was Roberts's years of honest work. Building the case against him is the kind of irony that only appears in stories where both sides of a conflict are conducted with genuine integrity. Most conflicts of this kind, between a criminal enterprise and the law enforcement apparatus trying to stop it, are not conducted with genuine integrity on either side. The Frank Lucas case was different because both Frank and Roberts, in their respective roles, brought to their sustained conflict the same quality, a consistent commitment to doing the work correctly rather than conveniently, regardless of the institutional pressure to take shortcuts. This shared quality is what made the relationship that developed between them after the conflict ended not just possible, but perhaps inevitable, the logical outcome of two men who had spent years recognizing, through the quality of each other's work, that they were dealing with someone who understood what integrity actually meant. The lasting significance of the Frank Lucas and Richie Roberts relationship extends into the broader story of what the Frank Lucas case meant for New York and for the institutions it exposed. The 100+ convictions that resulted from Frank's cooperation were Richie Roberts's case built to its ultimate conclusion. The patient financial investigation that Roberts had conducted for years, combined with the inside account of institutional corruption that Frank's cooperation provided, producing together a body of evidence that reshaped the institutional landscape of New York law enforcement in ways that neither man could have produced alone. Roberts built the case. Frank built the cooperation. Together, they produced something that exceeded what either could have achieved working separately against an institutional corruption that both, in their different ways, had refused to accept as simply the inevitable condition of the world they inhabited. Roberts had refused to accept it by maintaining his professional integrity in an environment that actively discouraged it. Frank had refused to accept it by, ultimately, deciding that the corruption he had funded and maintained was not something worth protecting when the cost of protecting it was his own future. Both refusals were, in their different ways, expressions of a form of integrity that the simplified narrative of the Frank Lucas story, the brilliant criminal brought down by the honest cop, never quite captures. Because the simplified narrative requires one side to be the hero and the other to be the villain. And the actual story of Frank Lucas and Richie Roberts is one where both men demonstrated the same quality at the same time in radically different contexts, and where the meeting of those two demonstrations of integrity produced, on the other side of everything, a collaboration that neither had expected and that turned out to be one of the most significant things either of them did. That is the story. A cop who spent years hunting the king. The king who, when he needed someone he could trust, chose the cop. And the specific form of mutual recognition that sustained opposition, honestly conducted, produces between two people who are paying close enough attention to understand what they are actually seeing in each other. It is not a story about friendship. It is not a story about redemption. It is a story about what integrity actually means when it is tested against the most difficult circumstances available, and about what happens when two men, on opposite sides of a sustained conflict, both pass that test. Consider what this relationship required from each man, because the requirements were not trivial. For Frank Lucas, Trusting Richie Roberts required something that ran directly against the grain of everything his world had taught him about how to relate to law enforcement. The code of the criminal enterprise, understood by everyone who operated within it, was absolute on this point. You do not trust cops. You manage them, you pay them, you use them when they are useful, and avoid them when they are not. But you do not trust them in any fundamental sense. And you certainly do not invite the cop who spent years building the case against you into your most sensitive legal matters. Every instinct developed over a lifetime in that world pointed away from the decision Frank Lucas made. What pointed toward it was the specific and sustained evidence of Roberts's behavior, evidence that Frank had been observing from the other side of the conflict for years. The quality of the investigation that Roberts had built told Frank Lucas something about Roberts that no amount of reputation or recommendation could have conveyed. That this was a man who did what he said he would do, who built what he set out to build, and who brought the same consistent standards to everything he touched. In Frank Lucas's world, that was the only proof of trustworthiness that actually meant anything. For Richie Roberts, accepting the representation required something equally demanding: the willingness to set aside, completely and professionally, the years of effort he had invested in putting Frank Lucas in prison, and to bring to Frank's legal interests the same quality of committed representation he would bring to any client. This required a form of professional integrity that went beyond simply following the formal rules of legal representation. It required genuinely caring about the outcome for a man whose criminal career had caused real harm to real people, the harm of blue magic in Harlan's communities, the harm of the corruption Frank had funded and maintained across the law enforcement institutions of the city. Roberts was not naive about this harm. He had spent years documenting it in his own way, through the investigation that traced the economic and institutional consequences of Frank's empire. The willingness to bring genuine commitment to Frank's legal interests, despite full knowledge of that harm, was itself a form of integrity, the professional integrity of a man who understood that the legal system's promise of competent representation was not contingent on the personal history between attorney and client, and who was willing to honor that promise, regardless of what the personal history between him and Frank Lucas contained. Both men, in other words, were required to extend trust across a history that made trust seem almost impossible. Both did it anyway, and the relationship that resulted measured not in sentiment, but in the specific quality of the work Roberts did for Frank's legal interests, and the specific confidence Frank placed in that work was real in the most important sense available. It produced results, and it lasted. This is ultimately what trust means when it is real rather than performed. Not the absence of reason for suspicion, not the absence of history that would justify wariness. The decision to extend commitment across that history because the evidence of the other person's demonstrated integrity makes the commitment worth making. Frank Lucas made that decision about Richie Roberts. Richie Roberts made it about Frank Lucas, and the relationship that followed, built on years of sustained opposition that had been conducted with genuine integrity on both sides, was durable in the way that things built correctly always are. The last years of Frank Lucas's life, he died in 2019 at the age of 88, were, by most accounts, the complicated later chapters of a man who had been simultaneously one of the most significant criminal figures in New York City history and one of the most consequential contributors to the anti-corruption effort that reshaped the city's law enforcement institutions. He gave interviews. He cooperated with documentarians. He watched the Ridley Scott film and expressed his opinions about what it got right and what it simplified. He lived in New Jersey and remained, in the ways that were available to him, connected to the world and the history that had defined his life. Richie Roberts continued his legal career, represented other clients, and maintained his own account of the Frank Lucas years, an account that has, in various interviews and in the documentary record of the period, consistently emphasized the specific quality of what developed between the two men on the other side of their sustained conflict. When Frank Lucas died on May 30th, 2019, the tributes and the obituaries told a story that was both true and incomplete, the story of the brilliant criminal, the empire, the Vietnam coffins, the cooperation, the 100 convictions, the story of Richie Roberts, and of what their relationship revealed about both men, and about the specific form of trust that genuine integrity can produce even across years of opposition, was present in the tributes, but not at their center. This video has tried to put it at the center because it belongs there, not because it is the most dramatic element of the Frank Lucas story. It is not. Not because it is the most consequential element. The empire and the cooperation were both more consequential in their direct effects, but because it is the most revealing element, the element that shows most clearly what kind of man Frank Lucas actually was. Underneath the legend and the mythology and the simplified narrative of brilliant criminal brought down by honest cop, the kind of man who looked across 30 years of conflict and saw in his most persistent adversary someone whose integrity he trusted more than almost anyone else he had ever known. The kind of man who chose, when it mattered most, the person who had most clearly demonstrated through their actions, rather than their words, what they were actually made of. That is the real Frank Lucas, not the shooting on 116th Street. There is a final question this story raises that deserves a direct answer, because it is the question that most people arrive at when they hear about this relationship for the first time. How is it possible that Frank Lucas, who spent his entire life operating in a world where trust was the most dangerous and most carefully managed commodity available, extended genuine trust to the man who put him in prison? The answer is the same answer that explains every significant decision Frank Lucas ever made. He looked at the evidence, not the evidence of what Roberts had done in the past, though that evidence was part of it, and an important part. The evidence of what Roberts was. The evidence of a man who had maintained a consistent form of integrity across years and at considerable personal cost, who had built his work correctly rather than conveniently, who had demonstrated through his actual behavior rather than his professed values that his word was worth something. Frank Lucas had spent his entire career distinguishing between people whose word was worth something and people whose word was not. He had spent his entire career building things that lasted because he built them on foundations that were real rather than convenient. When he looked at Richie Roberts, he saw a foundation that was real. And Frank Lucas, who understood better than almost anyone what that meant, built on it. That is the story. The cop who caught the king who chose the cop. The relationship that makes no sense until you understand both men completely. And that makes perfect sense once you do. Now subscribe if this story gave you something to think about that you didn't have before. Drop a comment with your honest answer. Does the Frank Lucas and Richie Roberts relationship make more sense to you now? Or does it still feel impossible? Because the gap between those two answers tells you something important about how you understand what trust is and where it actually comes from. And next week, we go all the way back to the beginning. Frank Lucas at age 6, North Carolina. The KKK. A cousin's death that set everything in motion before Frank Lucas had any idea what everything was going to become. The origin story. The first chapter. The thing that made the man who made the empire, who made the cooperation, who chose the cop, turn on notifications. You need to see where this started to fully understand where it ended. And it started in a place nobody talks about, in a moment nobody who wasn't there remembers, with a 6-year-old boy who saw something that no child should see and who decided, in the specific and irreversible way that certain childhood experiences shape everything that comes after them, that the world he had been born into was not going to be the world he died in. That is the origin. Next week, we go there. One last thought before this story closes. The world Frank Lucas and Richie Roberts both inhabited, the New York of the late 1960s and 1970s, the specific institutional landscape of narcotics, enforcement and narcotics distribution in a city where both were operating simultaneously, at their respective peaks, was a world defined by the absence of the quality that both men shared. Integrity was rare. Demonstrated integrity, the kind that shows up not in what people say about themselves, but in what they do when doing the right thing is inconvenient and expensive, was rarer still. Frank Lucas had built an empire in that world, partly because his specific form of integrity, the discipline and consistency and quality standards that he brought to building Blue Magic and managing his organization, was so exceptional in a world that usually rewarded shortcuts and sloppiness. Roberts had built his career in that world, partly because his refusal to participate in the corruption that surrounded him was so unusual in an institutional environment where participation was the norm. Both men paid real costs for their respective forms of integrity. Frank paid the cost of eventual prosecution by the one investigator who was doing the work correctly. Roberts paid the cost of institutional isolation and personal sacrifice in a career defined by refusing to take the path that most of his colleagues took. These costs were real and significant. And yet, on the other side of all the costs, what remained between them was more durable than almost anything else built during those years. The empire was gone. The corruption network was dismantled. The investigation was over. What remained was the mutual recognition of two men who had understood, from opposite sides of a sustained conflict, that they were dealing with someone whose word was worth something. In a world where that quality was as rare as it was, that recognition was worth more than most people understood. Frank Lucas and Richie Roberts understood it completely. That is why the relationship lasted. And that is why this story ultimately matters.